Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AJ 40 Under 40 in association with Vitra. I'm Emily Booth. I'm editor at the Architects Journal, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first AJ 40 Under 40 panel discussion about the do's and don'ts of setting up your own studio. The AJ 40 Under 40 celebrates the UK's most exciting emerging architectural talent. It is the first time since 2005 that the AJ has run this unique showcase of the next generation of agenda-setting designers and innovators. So thank you so much for joining us. Today's talk is going to focus on a series of virtual discussions with 4 of the AJ 40 Under 40 practices who will be sharing their insight and experience on how they've got to where they are now, what have been the biggest lessons from their failures and their many successes, and considering the question, is setting up your own practice always the right thing to do? We are absolutely delighted to welcome as our speakers today, Edmund Fowles, who's director at Feilden Fowles, Jonathan Hagos and Tom Bell, who are co-directors at Freehaus, Catrina Stewart and Hugh McEwen, the co-founders of Office S&M, and Nimi Attanayake and Tim O'Callaghan, co-founders of nimtim Architects. So they're each going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a short panel discussion before we open up the discussion for your questions. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to thank our sponsor, Vitra. Without their support, this event could not take place. So our huge thanks to them. We were meant to be hosting this panel discussion at Vitra's new flagship showroom in London, Clerkenwell, but of course, current restricting guidelines mean that that hasn't been possible this time. So hopefully everyone can join us there for a future event. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Nimi Attanayake and Tim O'Callaghan, who are co-founders of nimtim Architects. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to share our screen here.
So I guess I just wanted to quickly say thank you to AJ and Vitra for inviting us to speak. We're nimtim Architects, and we're going to quickly touch on some of our earlier projects which helped develop us as a practice. We try to put people at the center of our design process to create projects that everyone can relate to. And we began our practice testing our ideas on small residential projects.
So we started nimtim about 6 years ago. It was actually following Nimi's cancer diagnosis and subsequent recovery. So the story of the practice is quite a personal one. And after this experience, we wanted to create a practice that was kind of approachable and supportive of everyone we worked with. We began in our house, here's some pictures, with the dog, and eventually a part 1. And we're going to talk about 4 early projects, which really informed how we work. And we'll also talk a bit about the different ways that we got the projects, which I think is kind of interesting. And yeah, we're going to focus a bit on how the process of working with our clients informed what we do. So the first project is this one. It's actually one of our neighbours. So you can see our house kind of in the background. And they were looking to do a loft conversion, and we just sat down with them for a conversation, and we kind of said, you know, you're probably not going to be able to get one, but you could potentially do a rear extension. So the project came out of a kind of informal discussion, and I guess this is one of the lessons of kind of starting a practice, is you never know where your work's going to come from. So just be open and kind of honest and kind of as approachable as you can be with everyone. So the project is a simple rear extension. We got it under permitted development. The main challenge of the project was resolving a very, very steeply sloped rear garden. So it was more of a kind of very much a kind of landscaping response as much as an architectural one. We're going to rush quite quickly over the actual projects and not really talk about the architecture too much, but more about the kind of relationship with the clients and how that informed what we did and how our general approach as a practice kind of came out of that. So tight site, small budget,
fast learning curve,
bit of a learning curve, great clients, supportive clients who yeah, and it was working. And one of the great things you do when you're starting out, and if you start out working on domestic projects, you're working with a whole range of types of people from different backgrounds, different professions, and you can learn so much from the way that each of those people approach the project and approach different problems. So in this case, we really learn a lot from the clients. So I think we'll go on to the next one.
Yeah. So this is Yellow House, which was for young clients who had a really small budget but had really big creative ideas. And they wanted us to kind of test scenarios for their ground floor flat, looking at how it might work for them now, but also potentially how it might work for a lodger or potentially when they wanted to start a family. So the design was quite adaptable and flexible. And I guess what we learned a lot from this project was to try to push budgets creatively, using cost-effective materials, and also bringing the clients on board and sort of getting them to become part of the process. So they went on to sort of make the tiles for the tiled walls with friends, and also felt kind of empowered enough to suggest colour, which could lift a kind of simple space. And the yellow windows were their idea.
Nobody ever believes us about that, but
no.
It was their suggestion. The next project is a very small flat in Westminster, and this was one that was sent our way by Nimi's previous practice. It was too small for them to work on, so one big do: make sure you stay friendly with your previous practices. So the main challenge here is tiny flats. I think it was 38 square meters, but with these kind of grand proportions of a sort of Westminster mansion block. So the challenge here was like, how do we create it was for a child heart surgeon, and she wanted a pied-à-terre in London. How do we create a kind of livable one-bedroom flat in a tiny space that still celebrates the kind of proportions of this historic kind of piano nobile? So the kind of lesson here was kind of getting the client to buy into a big idea that kind of solved a kind of practical problem. And the big idea here was like, let's just keep it as one space and resolve the kind of functional requirements with a series of kind of objects that kind of sat within the space. And once you frame a kind of interesting idea as the best solution to a practical problem, then you can bring clients along with kind of quite interesting and sometimes even radical ideas. So yeah, a simple project, small project, but getting clients to buy into bigger concepts.
I guess, yeah, that sort of neatly leads on to Cork House, where we found actually that by bringing people on board to the process helped us kind of push what we could do and maybe try different things that was new for us as a practice. So I think it was important to try, to engage the clients and make them part of what we're trying to do. This was Cork House, which is one of our more well-known projects. But what's maybe not well known is how much the clients had an active role in this project. They were out there sourcing sinks and tiles and helping with colours. And it was a simple sort of idea of this stepped landscape internally that would drop down to their garden beyond. But we chose cork, which wasn't particularly used that much at the time. But we felt that it would be a really great solution here because of its environmental properties, because of its kind of finish. And I think our enthusiasm for it passed on to the clients who came on board, guns blazing, really. So that was really lovely, and led to a really good project. I guess reflecting on what we've done, we've seen the kind of power of giving clients that kind of empowerment to become part of the process and collaborate with us to make some of our kind of best and well-known projects.
I think it was kind of when we spoke to clients after finishing the projects, what they would say to us is that we don't feel like we procured a design from nimtim. We feel like we designed it ourselves and you kind of helped us. And, you know, we didn't start off with the practice with this kind of approach and methodology and process. It was something that developed through our work. And when we reflected on what we've done and when we discussed with clients how they felt that the process had happened and how the kind of building that we'd kind of given them. So having kind of learned this from our clients, we then went and kind of reflected on it ourselves. And we now have kind of built in that kind of process of co-creation into how we develop a building with clients. So we now put much more emphasis on the kind of briefing stage and kind of co-creation. That has so far been a lot with kind of homeowners and domestic clients, but we're now kind of bringing that to a larger scale and scaling it up to kind of working with communities and larger organizations.
And also, I guess we recognize the importance of trying to take on board builders on site and become, you know, bringing them into the process and learning from them, which has been really fantastic for us, especially when we're trying to do different things that we might not always know the best way to do it. So now I guess we're a practice of 7 of us plus the dog, based in South East London. I guess from these early projects, it's now led to a lot of other schemes, mixed use developments, large residential, nursery schools, mixed use live work sort of projects. And we recently won this competition for the Public Realm Works in Barking as part of Becontree Centenary, which is great. And we're now doing collaborations with larger practices on larger schemes, which has been another learning curve for us, but yeah, which we're thoroughly enjoying. And that was, yeah.
So I guess our summary is kind of like, you know, your projects can come from unexpected places. So always be open, always be approachable, and also learn from your clients and learn from your projects. You know, I think if you kind of approach those early projects with an open mind, I think your instinctive way of being and being an architect and practicing architecture can come out. So it's kind of, I think our process, our approach, our message came from the projects that we did, rather than a kind of preconceived idea of how we would do it.
Thank you so much, Nimi and Tim, for such a candid insight into how you work, and the importance of learning. That always learning comes across really strongly. Thank you so much. So next up, I would like to welcome Jonathan Hagos and Tom Bell, who are co-directors of Freehaus. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that's come through for everyone. Brilliant. Well, look, first of all, thank you for inviting us to expand a little on our journey as a practice and some of the things we've learned along the way.
So yeah, Freehaus is currently a practice of 6 with 5 architecture backgrounds, and Beatrice, our graphic and digital designer, who over the last 3 years has really helped us consolidate our brand values and our tone of voice so we can win work.
Tom and I have been working together since 2008, although we kind of have vague memories of bumping into each other at the Bartlett when we were both studying there. We started working together at a small practice called Consark in 2009, where I was a project architect and Tom was a director, where we delivered several projects together before we both left separately in 2012. Tom set up Freehaus in his back bedroom, and I was working on a feature film for a short period of time before coming back to London, and that's when we started talking about our future plans for a practice. So this is the beginning of our do's and don'ts. It's a bit literal, but.
So do consider whether running a practice is for you. I think running a practice, especially at the beginning, means you do absolutely everything. And there are lots of times when you don't actually get to design anything at all. There are ups, but there are also downs. So for us, sadly, like dealing with 4 break-ins and doing all-nighters with the police forensic team.
And I suppose off the back of that, do think about whether you want to go it alone or with a partner. So as I said, Tom and I built the practice off a solid working relationship. We started working together in 2008, and we knew that we could deliver projects together because we'd done that for so many years before setting up Freehaus. I think for us, having someone there with you every step of the way has been so invaluable. At the same time, I suppose it takes a mutual respect for each other's skill sets and the ability to support one another through that journey as well. Alongside that, investing in time in defining and also regularly redefining rather your targets. So when Tom and I set up, we spent about 8 months beforehand, really like defining the foundations of our working practice and our ethos and our values before committing to working with each other. And these discussions really actively fed into our business plan. So our 1-year, 5-year and 10-year business plans. And at the end of each financial year, what we do as a practice is that we appraise the year that's just gone against the aims that we had. We spend a lot of time thinking about our individual practice goals and our personal goals as well, and how we want to kind of intertwine them together, and what those targets are for the next year before meeting again as a team to kind of collate that into a singular plan. And these discussions can be quite broad. They can range from reflecting on our tone of voice, projects that we've completed, client experiences, and also projects we want to be working on and how we want to get there. So for us, as a priority when we set up Freehaus, both Tom and I had lots of experience delivering projects of a civic and community scale. And those aren't the types of projects you get when you set up a practice. So for us, it was about how can we draw from that previous experience to help us secure those types of projects in the future. And kind of getting there meant, I suppose, taking on stepping stone projects that we knew would kind of eventually get us to the point where we were working on projects that had more of a kind of civic gesture and a community scope. And also by curating our portfolio and stitching bits of our projects together from different sectors to demonstrate our ability and competence to potential clients as well.
Yeah, so don't assume that a Pompidou Centre will necessarily land in your lap. I think thinking carefully and investing in competitions is critical. You know, they do cost time, they cost money to enter, and the odds of winning are sadly quite low. So we think about it in a sense, we assess the value to our studio of entering a competition, but we evaluate on the basis that we might not win. We also appraise opportunities carefully and try and score ourselves to see if we can stand a fighting chance amongst 60 or 70 other entrances. We actually entered very few competitions in the first 5 years, believe it or not, and we've only really begun to have a good success rate in competitions after about year 7. But instead, as John sort of touched on, we opted to pursue private commissions where the odds of conversion and exposure to new clients and wider stakeholders was much higher.
Oops, sorry.
Getting this right first has now put us in a stronger position, I think, to win competitions. We now know how to articulate our working methodologies, we understand fees better, and we also have a portfolio to draw from. I think what's important is you've got to value your skills and really get paid for them. Support yourself, and in doing so, you'll support the industry.
Investing in your team. Do invest in your team. Knowing when you need support from others is so crucial, but also understanding that your team needs to be nurtured is so critical. So since 2012, we've had 19 people help us grow the practice. We're currently 6, and we're just about to interview for another position. Every year we hold a summer and Christmas away day. Sometimes they're architecture inspired visits. Sometimes we visit our projects abroad for a weekend. Most of the time, we just like to get close to the sea and go for walks and eat well and enjoy each other's company. I think for us, and I think, you know, nimtim mentioned this so much as well, it's like a practice is so much about its people as well as its projects. And I think really investing in the relationships and the working processes of the people around you is so critical to delivering good architecture, but also fundamentally enjoying setting up your practice?
Yeah, so do say no to work. I think trusting your gut's really important. You can spot a bad client from the very first meeting. So don't forget that you need to select your clients as much as they're looking to select an architect. Sometimes, obviously, your bank account will actually make the decision for you. But if you can, try and rest up and strategize instead. Think about the types of client that you want to work with and how you go about getting them. Because once you're committed to a client, that relationship can last for a very long time.
Don't get carried away. So this is something that we often have to fight the urge to do. But staying lean and agile for as long as you can. I think if Tom and I had to reflect on our experience over the last 9 years, being lean and agile is probably the number one advantage you have as a small practice. Have a roadmap of expenditure that aligns with your turnover ambitions. So don't splurge if you don't need to, because it will be better to save that money for a rainy day. So this is our first studio, which took us a while to get to, but we didn't pay any rent for that. We actually exchanged 2 days of architectural consultancy a month with our landlord, who was a design agency, and they gave us their back room, which was amazing because we suddenly had some space to work in. We weren't paying any rent. And actually through that architectural consultancy, we also picked up projects. So it was a really interesting way of growing the practice without necessarily committing to overheads. We've also both had teaching roles and have undertaken freelance work with former practices and also peers along the way to help support Freehaus. But also thinking laterally about the skills that you have as a practice as well as designers. So quite early on, we started dealing and designing our own products as well. And actually that brought kind of different revenue streams and also opportunities into the practice too. So thinking quite expansively about the opportunities that you can create.
Yeah, do invest in professional photography. So photography is obviously a valuable way of showcasing the finished piece of work whilst it looks new and current, but really don't forget to get really good photos of what it looked like before. So often we're asked in meetings or trying to explain what it might look like before, when if only we'd had that photo. Try using different photographers as well for different projects. I think spend time in advance of shoots to really discuss how to best celebrate that project, and also for those photos to reflect the values of your practice.
Just to be clear, the left-hand side photos are not the professional photos. Those are the ones that we took. And finally, do it because you love it. Building up your own practice is the most thrilling and rewarding thing you can do, but you do need to love it to get through the tough times, and there are a few tough times. But once you do, there really is there's no going back. So yeah, hopefully those are our kind of small bite-sized words of wisdom on our experiences over the last 9 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Tom. I love that. Do it because you love it. Okay, I think that's very good advice. Thanks so much. And now I'd like to welcome Catrina and Hugh, who are co-founders of Office S&M.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for having us along to talk today. I'm Hugh, and this is Catrina. And together we founded Office S&M in 2013 after we graduated from the Bartlett. This is our current team of 4, and when we are in the office, you can find us hanging around in Dalston. We work in a really collaborative way with our clients, with our teammates, and with the public. We experiment with colours and materials to deliver joyful private spaces and public places that elevate the everyday, some of which you can see on our website.
We work at many different scales, from home extensions such as this Valletta House project, to new built houses and multi-unit schemes. We often work with families and individuals to develop personal and characterful designs for their homes, exploring the use of inventive and often sustainable materials. With each of our projects, we respond to the context, the house, the street, and the neighbourhood, acknowledging the existing while deploying colour and narrative inventively to create drama. For example, this new build house is a new 3-bed house in Newham that proposes new design approaches to rented accommodation.
We've always worked with a 50-50 split of public and private clients. And we've ended up working for a third of the boroughs in London and on every round of the GLA Outer London Fund and Good Growth Fund on projects that range from public realm co-design through to food market fit out, for example, here at Nag's Head Market in Islington. And we started up the practice only working on public projects. So we're deeply interested in how people experience the places and spaces that we deliver. And this means that we really want to draw on the wants and needs of the people who end up using these spaces because they know it best. So for example, here through conversations, this developed a new co-working space that had the wellness of its occupants at the heart of the design.
So we'll take you back to before we actually set up the practice. We first met when we were studying together doing our masters at the Bartlett. And I think we soon found that we had many interests in common. We were both really interested in using colour as a building material. And I actually ended up writing my thesis on the topic. The work I produced at university proposed new ways of living. I proposed a city farmhouse, which was based on principles of a circular economy and using renewable energy sources such as biomass, methane, and human waste to fuel the whole community and building.
I think it's really important to show you what we did at uni because it kind of frames a lot of the work that we still do today. So the work I was producing alongside Catrina was concerned with how space could encourage political representation and also embody a representative democracy. This kind of evolved into a proposal for a new civic type of sort of style of building that you can see here and in the picture behind me. So this was developed through domestic materials, personal colours, and a wide range of sampling. And this process of sampling was to kind of give familiarity to these new spaces, whether it's because they were copies of spaces that worked well or covered in domestic symbols like satellite dishes that you can see on the left of this drawing, and which we'll come back to later in the presentation.
So after university, we each worked in several different architecture practices. And for a while, I worked on developing a handmade computer game called Luminosity, which explored play in spaces and architecture. And this was an adventure puzzle game, which actually went on to win a BAFTA Award for Artistic Achievement in 2015.
So we were working evenings and weekends at Office S&M during this time, but during the day we had other jobs. I was an architect at Metropolitan Workshop, working on the RIBA award-winning Mapleton Crescent, which is a 27-story tower for pocket living. And alongside the day job, a really important thing was teaching, which I'm sure kind of other practices speaking today have found. And teaching supported us financially, but it also importantly allowed us space to investigate and research topics that we couldn't yet build. And we've maintained this academic connection through writing with recent publications, including an article in the most recent AD curated by Owen Hopkins. Collaboration
is at the heart of our practice, and I would say this is definitely one of our top tips. And it's actually through collaboration with other architects that we were able to first start our practice. This was our very first project, collaborating with young Catrina architects, who was actually my third-year tutor, where we were redesigning a shopfront for Nana Yar supermarket, using patterns and colour to catch people's attention. Our first shopfront project developed into this more recent Shape Newham project, where we're working with AOC architects and Cava Huggard on several public realm interventions in Newham. And over the years, we have developed techniques for successful collaboration being appointed as lead consultants as well as sub-consultants to others.
And we also collaborate really closely with our clients, and we're looking forward to showing some of the results of these collaborations later this year. This is a recently published project called Motel House, where we designed characterful elements made from recycled materials that were based on discussions with the owner about their interest in ethical fashion. We're also working on larger scale multi-unit schemes, which utilize this crossover that we have between our public and our private understanding to bring the best of both sectors to bear on each and every project that we work on.
Like many young practices, we have been very active on social media platforms and have used these as tools to publish and disseminate our work. But it's also been really amazing to see how the public have used and interpreted our work and our projects. We are very much still developing our ideas. We first started exploring at university and now making these into reality. Here is one of our latest projects, a new earth house for a family in East Sussex who want to live a life off-grid. And here we're using recycled building materials, so in this case using earth-filled tyres as the structure, but also building a house that collects its own energy and water for the family.
And we're also finally cladding buildings with satellite dishes. I think my top tip is really remembering why you started a practice. What are you really, really interested in? Together, we've been working on themes from our university research that's led right through to the work that we do today at Office S&M. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Catrina and Hugh, for that insightful presentation. I think the focus on collaboration was really inspiring there. Thank you so much. And now I'm delighted to welcome Edmund Fowles, who's director at Feilden Fowles.
Great, thank you. Just share my screen. Brilliant. What tough acts to follow. It's been fascinating listening to all those other wonderful studios talk about their work. And I'd like to talk you through some of our advice for the do's and don'ts. So our practice was founded by Fergus Feilden and myself, Edmund Fowles. Officially, we say in 2009, but as many of us will know, and these things sort of have their infancy maybe many years before that. Ferg and I studied together at university, went our separate ways for part two, and then reconverged on a project that was in South Wales, our first project. And we often sort of say that the practice really started in a hole in Wales, because this was actually before 2009. We were building a passive longhouse family home in Wales while we were studying our part two. And this really kind of established our principles and our values as a practice. It really distilled all of our core objectives, our interests around craft and making, sourcing materials locally. And I think this sort of really kind of leads to the first point, which is very early on, if you want to establish a practice, establish your key core goals. You know, what's the purpose of your practice? What are your values? And really try and stick to them. It's quite hard sometimes, because sometimes you need to take on work to keep people being paid and pay the bills and pay the studio rent. But if you can stay true to your values, it shows in the work. And the principles of our first project, T-Pren, we've now come to call low tech, and it's a piece of work that we're doing 10 years later as a practice, exploring this idea of how we can build more responsibly in a more lean and low tech way. And also, many people sort of do down private residential projects, and I think they're incredibly important. And it was really interesting to hear nimtim talk really passionately about their early resi projects, and we did our fair share of residential projects in our early years, and they were vital to establishing your craft, honing your skills as an architect. For many young architects working in bigger practices, you don't get that close connection to your clients, you don't get that close experience of working on site. But when you set up doing small projects, whether it's a kitchen extension or a small refurbishment or a barn conversion, they're absolutely vital to build that set of skills so you can take those forward in the future. But then it's also our advice that don't necessarily always work on private residential projects, and they can be incredibly laboursome. And as a growing practice, we find private residential quite hard to make stack up now. So I think it has a real value, and they're very enjoyable projects to work on. But importantly, if you want to be working on more cultural projects, you need to find ways to sidestep away from that and use those projects to sell your work on other scales or types of projects. So very early on in 2013, we actually began working with a school in the Southwest, and it's really hard to win your first non-resi project, but here we kind of offered our time. We did a very, very cheap master plan for this school. I think the first project we did for them was a little canopy structure, but then we went on to establish a brief for a learning kind of centre, and later went on to kind of win that scheme. And that led to our first non-residential project, our first education project, which was a real milestone for our practice. So that helped us move away into different sectors, and then from that point we could sort of step to different sectors as well. So it's really important as well to make a plan, and that plan should be informed by your values. As a practice, we've always had kind of two sorts of plan. We have a kind of bigger picture strategic plan, and then a more practical kind of annual practice plan, which is rewritten and looked at every year. So it's vital that you look at this plan. You don't just write a business plan, put it in a drawer and forget about it. You know, it has to be a really active tool. It has to be engaging, and it's something that should be shared with your whole team as well. And we use it to strategize about scale. How big do we want to be? What sort of projects do we want to work on? What scale projects do we need to win? What range of project scales should we work on, or sectors? So use it, keep it updated, and try sticking to it. Each year as well, we update our kind of practice timeline, because I think it's a really interesting thing to reflect on, and to see kind of certain relationships between perhaps when you had you won your first award, or when you took on certain people, and what competitions maybe came off the back of that. So this combines all sorts of aspects of our practice, from turnover to key practice milestones, projects, competition wins, award wins, people. It's really useful. But at the same time, don't necessarily always stick to the plan. Don't be too rigid in what you set out, because sometimes things come along and it's quite hard to say no to them. In 2015, we met Charlie Bigham, and we thought he was a bit crazy because he wanted to build a pie factory in the middle of nowhere. And we'd never designed a factory, we've never done a commercial building. He'd launched a competition against some very established architects, Hopkins, Grimshaw, who knew very well how to build factories. And we absolutely leapt at the opportunity to do just this extraordinary, very different sort of project for us, and apply all of our skills from our work in the education sector to workplace, and to creating a campus, a food production campus. And amazingly, the project went ahead and was delivered and was really successful. But it just goes to show that don't doubt your ability. I think, like, even if you think a project's too big or too ambitious, or just you don't have the skill for it, you'll find ways of skilling yourself up, of bringing in advisors to help you deliver work that you didn't perhaps think was possible at the outset. And I think there's a really interesting chain of relationships between all projects. For us, Charlie got to know us through our work for one of the school projects we did, because his children went to that school. He liked the building. He put us on a list as a kind of wild card practice. And I think it was down to our values as a practice and what we could bring in addition to others that he really loved. And we built a very strong relationship with him and continue to work with Charlie. So that kind of leads me to really seize opportunities when they come along, or rather be ready to seize on opportunities. So that's down to kind of perhaps having a bit of spare capacity, if you can, to jump onto competitions. We were offered a wonderful opportunity to partner with a couple of education charities on a site in Lambeth on Royal Street. So this is the Thames in the centre here, and this site is just a stone's throw from St Thomas's Hospital. When we arrived there, it looked something like this, and the charities wanted to open up the space for learning for their schools, but they didn't have any money. They needed planning permission and the vision, and we helped them to come up with this idea to build a city farm on this site. But the only way to make that possible was to partner with them and get much more heavily involved. And we ended up striking a deal to say, if we can build on a small portion of this site to build our own studio, then we'll work for free for you. We'll do a design, we'll get you planning, we'll help you fundraise and deliver the farm project as your partner. And it was a really successful project. It was a real leap of faith for us because it was a great kind of investment building our own studio space. But it came off the back of that larger commercial project we were doing for Charlie Bigham. So it's fortuitous. These two opportunities came along almost simultaneously and were reciprocal. But this has led to our current home, which is on the Waterloo City Farm. And it's become a thriving site for our practice. It's really transformed the culture of our practice and our team, being linked to these community groups and education groups. And it comes right back to that starting point of identifying your values and kind of knowing the reasons you want to set up your own practice and why you're doing it. So importantly, look after your team. Our team is now 20 individuals. We've got an amazing team. Sadly, we've not been all together like this for some time now. But I think it's vital going on team visits, eating together communally for lunch, and having a bit of extra space now with this new studio has allowed us to completely transform that kind of culture, the ability to experiment outdoors, make prototypes in the gardens, and to put on events. And so really kind of supporting and nurturing the team. And finally, don't give up. It's a long slog. It's a hard process. The early days in particular are really, really tough and really challenging. I think I'd probably say the first 5 years are exceptionally hard, but there are lots of ups and downs, but it's worth it. So persist and keep going. Thank you.
Edmund, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and learnings there so candidly. I think the don't give up point is a really strong one. And thank you all again for really such useful and informative presentations. I just think so much insight there, and so much ground covered as well. Really useful stuff. Perhaps we could start with the question mentioned by Freehaus, actually, Jonathan and Tom. Is it important to question for people starting out in this whether you even want to set up a practice? I mean, I wonder whether you might speak a little bit further on that, Jonathan. It's like that point. What is that step it takes, and what are the pitfalls? What would you caution against in setting up a practice?
Thank you. I'll also invite Tom to kind of interject if he has any
Tom,
thoughts.
go for it.
I think in many ways, I think the seed to set up your own practice is planted through education. And certainly if I reflect on my experience at the Bartlett, where I did my undergrad and postgrad, you are being taught by practitioners who are also either in the process of setting up their own practices or really kind of have a key, I suppose, approach to authoring their own work and directing their own work. So in many ways, you're kind of gleaning a lot from that. I think I personally was quite fortunate to then spend a lot of time in other practices to get a sense, and quite small practices as well, to get a sense of different approaches and different working methodologies. But I think I always had an ambition to not necessarily self-direct, but work in an environment where we had more of an ability to kind of guide one's own kind of future and destiny, I suppose. And it was, in many ways, working with Tom over those 4 years at Consarc that we were able to kind of understand that we had quite a lot of commonalities in terms of approach to social value, approach to work as well. And that really was instilled and embedded into the kind of values of our practice. So there was never really a point in which I think either of us doubted that this is what we wanted to do. Because again, I think that seed had been planted like from part one, you know, it was already kind of in that idea of a trajectory. And in many ways, education kind of gears you towards trying to anticipate what that trajectory is too. I think one of the things that we did, and Edmund spoke about this as well quite clearly, is spending a lot of time really defining your values. So before Tom and I even decided that we would go ahead with this, we had, you know, it was, we say 8 months, but it was probably much longer than that, of walks and cigarettes and sitting on benches and just talking about what we wanted to achieve, and not from a design perspective, like how did we want to live. You know, we were both in the process of getting married, starting families, and those were so key in terms of how a practice would fit around that, not the other way around.
I'd only add, I think that's very insightful. I think I'd only add that don't equate starting a practice with architectural success. I think there are many ways in which architects can be successful. I think you have to go into setting up a practice because it is what you want to do, not because you think it's what you should do.
Thank you so much. And Nimi and Tim, you talked with real insight about that co-creation process, you know, that working with a client. Have you got any more insight into that in terms of what makes for a really strong client relationship when you are starting out, when you're setting up a practice? What people might do to really strengthen and make those relationships work?
I think some of the others touched on it as well. I think it's just being open to learning from them as well. Like all of our clients come from different places, you know, different occupations, and I think our sort of our process, we try to listen, we try to sit back, as well as try and design and create a project. We're also listening to what they need, what they want, and I guess sort of working out how we can do that together.
Yeah, I think listening is key. I wanted to say something about your previous question actually to Jonathan.
Oh, of course.
If that's okay. I think the idea of staying up a practice, I think the first question I'd ask, or I'd give it to anyone who was thinking of it, is like, can you find fulfillment in the place that you already are or within another organization? And also to people who run practices, can you make your staff and your colleagues feel so kind of fulfilled in both their professional and private lives that they don't want to start a practice? And I think it's a bit of I think the kind of idea of setting up practice is so embedded in architectural thinking, but it's kind of, I think in some ways it's a kind of a problem. I mean, obviously we've all had great experiences setting up practices, but I don't think it's necessarily the right answer. And I think one thing that we've tried to do as our practice is kind of make sure that our values and our kind of mission reflects everyone, so everyone kind of feels like they can input in it, and also to try and all the time ask them, like, how can we make you feel fulfilled and happy to be here? And I think, you know, we've got staff that have been with us like 4 or 5 years almost since we started, and I, you know, what I want most of all is for them not to feel the need to go off and start their own practice, that they feel fulfilled and happy enough to stay with us.
We definitely don't want to lose them. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's like, yeah, I definitely would kind of say the first question is, can you not find what you want where you are?
Good thoughts and perspective there. Edmund, you talked about not giving up. Don't give up. Is there ever a point where you have wanted to give up, and what's your advice for getting through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us will have had that bitter experience of receiving a phone call saying, you didn't quite make the cut, I'm sorry, you didn't win the competition. And, you know, that's after months of slaving away on drawings and really pouring your heart into things, you know, and as a profession, you know, we do really pour everything into our work. So it's very hard, it's hard not to take it personally. So those are the real kind of low points for me personally, is sort of losing competitions, and that's the real kind of hit. But through each of the competitions or projects that we've not been successful in securing, you know, you learn a huge amount. You might partner with a new consultant, or you might collaborate with another design team or another architect, and through that you forge really strong connections. So a good example is a landscape designer, Janelle Gibbons, Joanna Gibbons and her team, wonderful landscape architects. I'm not sure if they'll be listening today, but we did a couple of competitions together with them, which didn't work out. And third time lucky, we did a competition for the Natural History Museum to redevelop their gardens, and we won it. It was like absolutely over the moon. But that perhaps wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had those two experiences on competitions that weren't successful, because we'd built this wonderful relationship, even though we'd not built a project together, and we knew that we were so aligned in terms of our values, and we wanted to work with them again. And then I think that came through, that the kind of relationship of these two practices was really aligned, and that really shone through, I think, in our presentation. So I think you can always kind of come through adversity.
That's, yeah, that hanging in there, that resilience. Catrina and Hugh, I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the importance of building a brand and marketing, you know, when you're setting up. How important has that been to you? You seem to have done that very successfully. Have you got any tips on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we, you know, actually from the very beginning, even when we were at university, we were encouraged to set up our own blogs. And that, I think, was the first time that I suppose that we were publishing our work, you know, beyond university, beyond the crit, and beyond, you know, your kind of peers. And from there, we did start, you know, using kind of blogs, and then, you know, Facebook and Instagram and things like that. And that's been a really good way for us to, you know, publish our work without spending any money. And it's also been a really good way to, you know, reach out to newspapers, to, you know, other kind of journals and print publications as well. So absolutely, and I think, you know, more and more we see practices using video and YouTube as platforms, you know, to be able to actually, you know, get your kind of work out there. And many other industries use that so much more than architects, and I think it's definitely a kind of missed opportunity, and yeah, something that we've found really useful.
I think because narrative is such a big part of how we design, that naturally that kind of storytelling is then, you know, there, and you just kind of have to impart that to other people. And I think, you know, kind of authenticity is very important, that it's about explaining kind of what you do and why you do it, rather than imagining that you've got to make up a brand or kind of, you know, come up with an artificial way of explaining something. So yeah, I think as Catrina says, it's really something that's kind of almost sort of natural now.
Thank you so much. A really, really lively and informative discussion. Thank you. We've actually already got loads of questions from the audience. So just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to ask questions. And I'm very happy now just to really take some of these questions from the audience. There's one here that I think applies to everybody. What has been your biggest mistake, and what did you learn from it? Should we start with you, Edmund?
Such a good question, but a hard one to pinpoint. Nothing comes to mind actually. And maybe give me 2 minutes and
I'll give you 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes. Nimi and Tim, biggest mistake. What did you learn?
We were just wondering as well, but I don't know if it's a mistake as much as something that we've realised. Is like learn about business, like how to run a business.
I think we loved at the beginning that we would do everything. We love, that's one of the like joys of running a practice, but it's also very daunting because you realize how much you don't learn. Like, especially, we'd been working in practice, but you don't always get to do all the roles that come with running a practice. And I think maybe one of our biggest mistakes was maybe not doing that more when we were in our previous practices, or finding ways to kind of get those opportunities to learn.
Yeah, like being successful is like, as an architecture practice, is maybe not even 50% the architecture bit. It's like running a good business. And the two things are connected. So if you come at it with the mindset that like doing, I mean, I was so impressed with, we're still impressed because we don't do it, even though we're trying to be better business people, but I was very impressed with Edmund's business plans and strategic plans, and Jonathan talked about it as well. And we're still floundering around a bit, but learning how to run a good business it's connected to being a good architecture practice. And I don't know if it's changing now. I mean, we weren't really taught that at university, but I would be like, learn about how to run business. Like we're doing coaching and we're getting outside help and advice on how to have a better business. And that's so key. And it connects with your ideas, and your values of how you deliver architecture and how you run a business are connected. So not to think of them as distinct, but like another part of your skill set as an architect is running a healthy, profitable, and well kind of run business.
Thank you so much. Catrina and Hugh, I don't know whether you want to add to learning from your mistakes.
I think kind of in a very similar vein, I think it's really knowing your limits, and know what you can't do, because it's really important to work with other good people and sort of, surround yourself with a really good team and surround yourself with really good advice. And yeah, I think making sure that you've got that team of really good people is so important.
We've got loads of questions on fees here and managing finances at the start of a new practice. I'm wondering if people can give advice on how you best do that and structure fees for small projects. So really just perhaps specific tips on that. So many questions on fees. Money's important. Perhaps if we go to Jonathan and Tom for that.
Sure. I think this kind of dovetails quite nicely with the point that Tim just made, just about kind of really embracing the business side of things. And in many ways, I think Tom and I, when we set up, we kind of went into it with our eyes wide open, in the fact that we hadn't set up a business before, we hadn't run a business before. And we kind of gobbled up as much outside help and assistance as we could. So a lot of that was kind of through CPDs, just like really basic things of like, how do you write a fee letter? What type of, how do you write a fee letter to a residential client versus a commercial client? What's the different mindset of that? And trying to put yourself in a client's position as well. What information do they need? What information do they need to compare your scopes of services with someone else's? And also fundamentally, how much does it cost you as a practice to deliver those services? And that has taken us years to get to refine. And it's all, and you never sit still. So the conversation on fees changes, I think for us, Tom, I don't know, I want to say quarterly, but we always have to reappraise it. Did we make enough money on that project? Do we have the tools to even understand whether we did make a loss or a profit on that project? How sophisticated are we? I mean, a big part of the conversation we're having now as a practice is we're now engaging on projects of a scale which require us to be much more sophisticated with the tools that we have to measure things like profitability or resourcing. And it means that you're constantly having to refresh and learn. So some of those early learnings that we did, CPDs, as I said, they've taken us so far, but again, how do you inject more knowledge into that? Tom,
Yeah,
I'm not sure if there's...
Yeah, I think perhaps don't always answer the question directly when it comes to fees, in a sense that I think, often we're faced with how much is it going to cost? And actually what we really need to be answering is, what services do you need? How do you want us to facilitate the project? We are, one of our trade secrets, I guess, is we often provide multiple fee proposals for different levels of service. Whether you want the basic value, you want a bit more, do you want, and in that way, it's the upsell, the bolt-ons, what can you add, how can you give a client choice to find the fee that they want for the service that they want you to provide. Often you can't do that if you just give them a lump sum.
Thank you so much. And in terms of keeping control of costs, again, sort of questions on the business side of running your practice. Edmund, I don't know if you have any advice on that, really keeping a tight rein on that, managing that side of the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, this comes back to the first question you asked about biggest mistakes, and it's similar in terms of the answers nimtim gave, but not taking on kind of a studio manager type figure sooner, I think, is a really strong piece of advice to people. They can offer so much expertise that you're not trained to run a business, you're not trained to do bookkeeping and all of these other activities that tend to drain an awful lot of your time in those early days, when really you need to be focused on the work and delivering the best projects possible, winning work, not worrying about VAT returns and so on. So I think that would be kind of a big piece of advice, and like not sort of putting that off, because they will return their value easily, within the first year. But in terms of monitoring costs, I mean, it comes back to that kind of idea of business planning and setting out budgets, at the start of each year, being really clear about where you want to invest money and where you can be really lean. I think that was a really good point Jonathan made earlier about leanness of business. Our overheads were very low for the first few years, renting very cheap space. It's very important to have space to work in, collectively work in, but being mindful to kind of, you've got finite resource usually, so using that finite budget very, very cautiously is important. And actually, we invested quite early on in some external PR help, which on the face of it seemed quite a luxury and quite expensive to do, but it was really valuable in terms of helping us to raise our profile. And it came at a point where we maybe 5 years in, and we had 2 or 3 projects finishing, and we just wanted a bit of help just to kind of get them into the right places. And that's been really sort of transformative, really, for our practice.
Thank you. You've all, one way or another, really talked about the value that you bring, the value of what it is that you do. Talking about money again, and Tim, this one is for you. You recently shared on Twitter how surprised you were to learn how much you'd earned in 2020. I'd really like to know what is your take on what is important to run a profitable practice, and that is a question from the floor as well.
Yeah, I kind of overshared there, and it's sort of
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, I think there's lots of caveats to it. It was it was kind of the year of COVID, and
of course
we really kept a lot of money in the practice because we were kind of, at that point, we lost 50% of our projects. And we'd also taken lots of time off because we were adopting our young daughter. So we were taking lots of personal time off. So yeah, but I think like getting a handle on finances and also recognizing your value. And that's one of the things actually we learned from our clients. And I mean, the practice management and financial management when we were doing those early projects that we showed you were just non-existent. And we were charging our time out at like £25 an hour, and we'd give our clients invoices, and they'd say, "Look, I'm paying you double what you've invoiced us because, like, it does not reflect the value that you've given us." And so, I guess we really learned on the hoof. We hadn't been very close to the kind of business running of our practices in our previous offices, and so we're learning on hoof. And another thing that I think architects don't realise very often is the value that we bring. And going back to the kind of question of like, how do you work out your fees? It's almost like work it back, like what value are you giving to the client? And having a very close handle on your resources, which is essentially your time and your staff's time that you put into the design work that you do. And obviously you can do that in different ways, but I think recognizing your value is something really, really key, and where you give value to people and structuring your fees around that. It's, I think, one of the best bits of advice that we could give.
Good stuff. Here's another one that really looks at architectural education and links that idea of business and education. Do you feel that architectural education should include specific entrepreneurial modules or assessment criteria to help prepare people who want to set up a practice? Catrina and Hugh, I don't know if you'd like to address that. So should architectural education really look at this, look at specific modules, business models, etc., entrepreneurialism?
I think that would be really useful. I think when we started back in 2013, it was shortly after university, and we made plenty of mistakes and did a lot of kind of learning on the job. And I think it would have been really useful to have a little bit more of an understanding of how you run a business, to prepare you for that. But yeah, I think we are already seeing universities do that a lot more, and I think it is really, really valuable for students, and also to give them the confidence to go out and be entrepreneurial and do things that they explore ideas that they want to explore. But also to understand that if you're studying architecture, you don't necessarily need to become an architect. There's lots of other industries and lots of other skills that you learn at university, and to be able to give students that that understanding of those opportunities, I think is really, really valuable.
Thank you. This is a question that really looks at the importance of that client relationship that we've talked about during this discussion. How have you maintained the same relationship with your clients during the pandemic? Edmund, I don't know if you'd like to talk to that point.
Yeah, I think it's been really tough for all of us, I'm sure. And whilst actually many projects that were in the earlier stages have been relatively easy to keep going, and even projects on site, we've had a bit of delay on one of our sites, but that's been possible to keep going. But I think where it's been really tough is the very earliest stages, kind of winning work, making new relationships, and sort of winning new work during the pandemic period. It's sort of harder to kind of cultivate new relationships, new contacts. But in terms of maintaining relationships, I think we've muddled through. We've been obviously doing everything online. We've probably found that we're talking a bit more to some clients as a result of not seeing them face to face. But yeah, what we've really found is it's that kind of very earlier stage. It's so much harder not to be able to kind of physically meet people, go for a drink, and kind of really build those relationships early on.
And Jonathan and Tom, I don't know if you'd like to address that at all, how you maintained those positive relationships during such a tricky time of working remotely.
It has been hard. I mean, in many ways, if I had to spin it, I would say we're working on projects where we have so many different stakeholders around the table, so many different client groups, that actually the positive, although obviously it's quite difficult to speak of positives during this time, one of the small positives is that it kind of slightly humanizes the process. Everyone is in their home, and I think in many ways, I think it kind of makes it slightly less confrontational. Not that it was overtly confrontational, but I think it does in many ways slightly reiterate this idea that everyone is around the table. It's a bit like the version of a circular table where everyone has equal weight. This Zoom is kind of the equivalent of that. And I think that has been positive because it means that we can actually check in with our clients much more regularly than we used to, much more frequently. But it also means that everyone can occupy the same space and also potentially have equal voice. Yeah, that would be the one slight way I think that we've been able to maintain positive relationships.
I think that some of the challenges are, though, through remote working is that the sort of the tone of voice gets changed slightly, or it's slightly tone deaf. So I think we've had to sort of touch base with our clients a lot more regularly during this period to make sure we're still keeping those relationships as good as we can.
I think one thing I'd also add, I think, and Edmund touched on this as well, I think for us, we've seen that nurturing relationships with potential clients to the point in which they kind of are realized into an opportunity, as in a paid project, to be crude, that takes us like 18 months, maybe 2 years. You know, if we think about some of our early commercial projects, cafes, restaurateurs, they were at least 18 months. So I think we're very cognizant of the fact that we really should be starting to develop new relationships with clients right now, because they're only going to be realized in 2-3 years' time. And how we do that is quite challenging. And it does mean we're having to be much more reliant on digital networks, much more reliant on LinkedIn than we used to be, to kind of try and not necessarily kickstart our network, but just trying to seek out where new opportunities might lie.
Thank you. So I'm just conscious of time, but we've got so many questions coming in. I think we've got time for 2 more that kind of cover off similar areas. So first, we've got a lot of questions about aesthetics and house styles. And the question is, how have you managed to keep a consistent identity, so a design language and your values, in the early days of setting up, when perhaps you were a little bit more at the mercy of clients' tastes? And is that important? How important is it to stay true to those values? Catrina and Hugh, perhaps if you'd like to address that. So maintaining that consistent identity of your design language and values back in that early days when you were really setting up.
I think this maybe goes on from what Nimi and Tim were saying, that actually it's about kind of working really, really closely with your clients to kind of develop ideas, but also to encourage them to take risks as well, and to not always kind of go, play the kind of be safe. And I suppose one of the things that we obviously use a lot is colour, and that feels to many like a really kind of, I don't know, maybe a brave move. But actually, things like paint are some of the most kind of, the cheapest material that you can get. And it's also something that you can change, all the time. So I think it is about, working really closely with your clients to develop these ideas, but also to, encourage them to be involved in the process of selecting materials and exploring materials. But at the same time to also challenge them a little bit and encourage them to be kind of brave. But yeah, I think it is also wanting to do something different for every project. Every project has different clients and there's different relationships and they're unique, and kind of celebrating that uniqueness.
Thank you. And just a last question now. So you're all young, successful architects. Are you proactive about encouraging other young architects in the profession? Is that something that's important to you? I don't know who'd like to answer this first. Perhaps Nimi and Tim. And what are you doing, I suppose, around that? What are you doing to encourage other architects in this amazing but sometimes challenging profession?
I think we are really keen to attract young architects, and also to show architects that there's a different way of doing things. I think when I was young, I only saw kind of established practices that were run by directors that were maybe 50 to 60 years old, predominantly white, and predominantly, you know, kind of come from an established route. And I think what we're keen to do is just show that there maybe is a different way of having a practice that's maybe more diverse. You know, you don't have to sit there and do all-nighters every day, but you can have a work-life balance. That's been really important to us. And we're, you know, we're trying to do, you know, we're trying to be affiliated with as many universities as we can, do loads of crits, do loads of panels, you know, take part in Stephen Lawrence Trust, and just put ourselves out there as much as possible so that people can see that we are an alternative, that we are an option, that can be a part of something that you get to.
And Jonathan, I really thank you so much. I really saw you nodding your head at that question in terms of encouraging younger groups.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is something that's so current at the moment. I mean, we're seeing, and I think Nimi talked about this towards the end of the presentation, opportunities to collaborate with other architects. So as younger-ish practices, I feel like we are getting opportunities, sometimes enforced by procurement processes, where bigger practices should collaborate with younger practices. And it has been a really exciting opportunity for us as a practice. We've been involved in much larger projects than we would ordinarily be involved in. And a lot of those practices have been incredibly nurturing outside of those competitions themselves, offering advice on company structure, BIM, you know, and it's been incredibly rewarding. And we have taken stock of that. And I think, well, so we are now starting to also be involved in projects where we need to create opportunities for younger architects as well. And we've just won our first project where we're collaborating with another practice, and it feels really important to establish a more collegiate way of working as architects, and one in which it's not overtly hierarchical. And I think the opportunity to work with some of these larger practices has been really rewarding, I suppose, to counter that truth, but also preconception that architects are, you know, quite linear, myopic, and crave authorship. I think actually there is a different way of practicing, and I think we are starting to see that, and starting to see that it's embedded in policy as well.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really mindful of the time. I think we just could have had so many more questions, but I hope that we've covered the most of them. So much there to learn from. I think particularly the way you all talked about the value of what you do, the importance of keeping going, that resilience point, the point of working in an open way, collaborative way with your clients, and the importance of those relationships. So really, just a huge thank you to all of you for being such wonderful speakers and for taking part in our event today. I'd really like to thank again our sponsor Vitra for making this event possible. And we absolutely look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.